This lecture constitutes a report on the state of marriage and the family in the West. By way of introduction, I would like to note my biblical catechism on sex and marriage. A number of Christian denominations are adding to their statements of faith a statement on marriage. In this catechism, I suggest defining marriage as the permanent one-flesh union of a male and a female. In this biblical catechism on sex and marriage, I also ask the question, what are the purposes of marriage? And the answer is, the purposes of marriage are procreational, familial, relational, and to satisfy sexual appetite. The argument I'm about to advance is that marriage is under attack or is being challenged in our day, in the UK and in Europe and especially in America. It's under attack on its understanding of being a relationship for procreation, a relationship that places a premium value on the family, a relationship that forms a kinship union, and a relationship that is the proper place for sexual appetite to be fulfilled. The rest of this lecture is going to look at various statistics, and not only should the statistics be paid attention to, but also some of the resources, since these statistics will need to be updated from year to year or from time to time. I'd like to begin with Patricia Morgan's The Marriage Files, an excellent resource. It was published in 2014, but it outlines the situation in England and in Wales. From 2000 to 2010, married people declined 200,000 to 20.4 million in 2010. Cohabitors, on the other hand, rose from 4 million to nearly 5.5 million. From the years 1990 to 2010, adult singles rose from 3 million to 11 million. And from the early 1980s to 2013, we can note some other statistics. Firstly, 80% of 25s were married in early 1980s, 60% in 2013, and a projected 42% by 2033. So people at the age of 25 are marrying less and less. By 2013, 24% of children lived with a single parent in Britain, and nearly half of 15-year-olds had experienced parental separation. But only 5% of 15-year-olds living with both parents will have unmarried parents. Continuing with statistics for England and Wales, it's to be noted that those who decide to cohabit instead of marry are 4 times more likely to break up. And then there's also this issue about what kind of divorce is allowed or what the process involves to get a divorce. No-fault divorce was introduced in the UK in 1969 to 1970. In 2019, there's a further discussion going on in Parliament about no-fault divorce regarding how long it takes to get a divorce. In the USA, California introduced no-fault divorce in 1970, and then other states followed. In 2010, New York accepted no-fault divorce. Now, there are issues around no-fault divorce in marriage and the value of marriage. If you say that you're not going to consider who's at fault, then you're also not looking at marriage with certain parameters around it to say, well, this is a legitimate marriage or this is a legitimate divorce, and rather just allowing couples to decide whether or not they want to continue with the contract. So by avoiding the sticky discussion of whether certain things have been broached to allow a divorce, the understanding of marriage has also been under attack. Now, there are complicating issues around no-fault divorce, what effect it has on the children, how much money is involved in getting a divorce, and so forth. This isn't the only issue, but what I want to note here is that by having no-fault divorce, there are certain things that are being said about marriage itself. There's some interesting statistics to look at over time regarding marriage and divorce, and this slide presents some of them. The U.S. Census Bureau reports that both marriages and divorce rates have declined in the last 10 years. 16.6 out of 1,000 women over 15 married in 2018, and 7.7 out of 1,000 divorced in 2018. This is a ratio of 46.4 to 53.6 out of 100. Now, any look at statistics and charts needs to take into account that in the U.S., from 2019, marriages are reported that include heterosexual and homosexual marriages. And that's going to change the statistics and ratios. So in some of the reporting that I will do in the following slides, I will only look at 2018, not 2019 and 2020 statistics. In 1960 and 2010, adults over 18 and over, we can report the following for different ethnic groups. Married whites in 1960 were 74%. That went down to 55% in 2010. Married Hispanics went from 72% in 1960 to 48% in 2010. And married blacks went from 61% in 1960 to 31%. You can see on the right side of this slide a comparison between 1960 and 2010 with respect to different groups, the never marrieds, the widowed, the divorced or separated, and the married. You can see the trend downwards. So for example, in 1960, 15% had never married, whereas 28% in 2010 had never married of the whole population. Or 72% were married in 1960, whereas 51% in 2010 were married. On this slide, we're going to compare several things. The median age has been going up for both men and women. In 1960, the median age was 22.8 for men and 20.3 for women. Whereas in 2010, the median age was 28.7 for men and 26.5 for women. The same study asks the question, is marriage becoming obsolete? And the answer to that question varies depending on the age bracket of people surveyed. So for example, for those who are 65 and older, 32% agreed that marriage was becoming obsolete. And as you get younger, the percentage increases. So the 18 to 29-year-olds agreed at the rate of 44%. We can also compare with this research whites, blacks, and Hispanics. 36% of whites agreed that marriage was becoming obsolete, 44% of blacks, and 42% of Hispanics. College makes a difference. Education makes a difference. The people who are higher educated will get married later. People who are higher educated tend to get divorced at a less frequent rate or percentage. And here in this questionnaire, is marriage becoming obsolete? 27% with college education agreed, 41% with just some college, and with a high school or less, 45% agreed about that. The last chart we have here is regarding millennials' family background. And here, again, we're looking at percentage. The percentage of people who were who had parents who were married while they were growing up. Now, for millennials, the percentage who had parents while they were growing up was 63%. For Gen X, 76%. For the baby boomers, 83%. And for those 65 and older, 89%. So we see a continuous decrease in the number of children reporting that they are from households where the parents are married. There are also considerations about finances and marriage or singleness, and it seems that it's arguable that there are certain benefits to being single in our society. There is assistance such as social housing and a basic income that is given to single parents. At first to casualties of divorce and then as single mothers. And this has to do with things that have been introduced from the 1970s to the 1990s in our society. Now, this may be compassionate, but nevertheless, it makes it more possible to be single with a child than in previous decades. There are also issues around taxation. Lone parents are given the same or more benefits than a married couple might be given. 95% of singles with children could lose their income if they got married or were living together and filing taxes. Resident fathers are taxed the same or more than single childless men. So these tax policies we have do not favor the family, but they tend to favor singleness or individualism. Also, we can talk about the rights of marriage with respect to pensions and property being extended to those who aren't married, to cohabitants, for example, marital benefits to those without the commitments of marriage since the early 2000s. And then we can also look at interpreting statistics about equal pay between men and women as favoring singleness or equalizing singleness with those who are married. There are a lot of issues around this issue of equal pay, but if those statistics that lead people to say that women are being discriminated against because there isn't equal pay for women are interpreted in a certain way, then what people end up doing is they say women, the standard will be where women are paid the same amount as men, but without qualification. Now, what kind of qualifications might come in on such a debate? Well, for example, if women step out of the workforce and step out of their career path because they bear children or raise children for a certain amount of time, then they're not going to be equal in the statistics to men who stay in the same job, move up the ladder, and might, at the same kind of job, have a higher pay for those reasons. So my point here is that we really have to dig into the statistics further than just looking at raw statistics on the issue of equal pay. And we do need to ask whether arguments around these statistics of equal pay are actually favoring individuals rather than the family and the marriage, in if we understand that to mean the marriage where the wife values, or the couple rather, values the raising of children by the mother at home for a certain period of time. There's a lot to be said about how children are treated in our Western society, and how this is changing the understanding of marriage as well. And I want to list a number of topics, but also give a few examples with regard to them without trying to exhaust the subject. One of the issues that's often in print is the power of the state versus the parent in raising the children. And we can see some extremes of this in the UK compared to the US, but it's not limited to the UK. And some of the legislation we've recently seen in Scotland particularly brings this issue up. Government gets involved in sex education, and our children are going to be given sex education by the state or by the state-run schools over against parental consent. There was a recent ruling. It was overturned eventually, but there was a recent ruling by a judge in England that required an abortion for a mentally handicapped woman over against her wishes and her mother's wishes. Her mother said she would raise the child. Thankfully, this was overturned, but this shows the state trying to step in and determine even an issue of life and death for children. There's also the issue of who allows the child to transition to a different gender, a topic that's often in the news. But some of the issues around this have to do with the state stepping in and claiming that the parents do not have rights. Children as young as 11 or 12 have, at times in the UK, had to give their permission to their parents to view their medical records, and teachers have been involved in withholding the children's gender choices from the parents. There's also the criminalization of parental physical discipline, and legislation that attempts to appoint a named person for every child to monitor the well-being or happiness of the child, not the parents having that right. That was pressed in Scotland and was finally struck down recently by the Supreme Court. But these are the kinds of issues where the state is trying to take away the authority of the parents over the children, over their own children. There are also issues around the care for children and how we understand family. Instead, for example, of the mother staying at home. We've already mentioned that with regard to taxation and finances. Other issues in education keep cropping up. Primary school sex education has tended recently, especially in the UK, to sexualize children, where children at a very early age are being taught sex education way earlier than previously. And then also in that teaching, in the curriculum, there is a normalizing of sexual abnormalities, a promotion even of alternative understandings of marriage, but also an encouragement for children to experiment with different gender options. And the gender options are not just male and female, but any number of options that are being presented to young children who don't understand these things. Another example of what's affecting our children has to do with adoption policies. And since 2002, homosexuals have been permitted to adopt children in the UK. Heterosexuals opposed to homosexuality may be rejected as fit parents as well. And that's been another issue in the news in the UK particularly. Some of this also applies more to Canada than to the US. The US tends to lag behind, but the same kinds of legislation are being presented in different states, and some more liberal states are further advanced in following the lead of countries like the UK or Canada. Regarding sexual education, by the early 21st century, sex ed curriculum for Key Stage 4 in the UK gave details for having anal sex. That's the last stage in pre-college education. Also, it introduces discussion of contraception, abortion, and transgender medical intervention. The question here is, what should be taught, by whom, and at what age? There are also other issues about in vitro fertilization for homosexuals. The National Health Services in the UK, required by the European Convention on Human Rights, that the NHS should pay for in vitro fertilization for heterosexual and homosexual couples. This means then that everybody's tax dollars are, or tax pounds in this case, are going to the NHS for these purposes. There's also the issue of the age of consent being lowered for sex. And then also gender transitioning questions. Children as young as 6 are being referred for this. Although it's interesting to note that in 2019, Spain ruled against all sexual transitioning surgery. Now, what about the U.S. statistics? Well, we can say a number of things here of interest. One thing to note right at the beginning is that married couples are increasingly having only one child. And we'll say a bit more about the birth rate in a moment. But continuing with this particular slide, births to unmarried parents are almost at half the number of births in the U.S. It's at 47.5%. Several things can be said about single mothers. 1 in 4 parents living with a child is unmarried, whereas 50 years ago it was only 7%. And then that has to do with the parents, but regarding the children, we can say that 32% of children live with an unmarried parent. A second thing to note is that single mothers often have children from sequential relationships, not from the same father. Furthermore, 42% of solo parents are white, and 28% are black, and 24% are Hispanic. Now, that doesn't break down in terms of percentage per percentage of the population. There are more whites in the population in the U.S., and therefore we would expect the statistic to be higher. So we would have to compare these statistics of solo parents to the ethnic breakdown in the U.S. For example, the number of blacks in the U.S. is about 12%. And so that would be an interesting comparison to take further then with respect to how many solo parents there are in each population. Fourthly, most solo parents are women. They would be 81% if they're white or 89% if black. And then fifthly, about 25% of solo parents live with a parent. So a quarter of those who are solo parents are living with their own parents or parents. Regarding cohabitation, 35% of unmarried parents are living with a partner. And 55% of them are white, 13% are black, and 25% Hispanic. A comment about broken families. By 9 years old, 20% of children born to married parents and 50% of children born to cohabiting parents will experience their parents' breakup. So this points to the fact that there are a lot of children coming from broken families, but that the statistic for parents who decide to cohabit and not get married, there's a huge jump to how many of those will break up. There's also a decrease in marriage. Fewer people are actually getting married. In 1970, 70% of adults 18 or older were married, whereas in 2016, 50% were. And then there's also some interesting data around people's changing perceptions about relationships, cohabitation, solo parenting, marriage, homosexual marriage. In 2015, 66% of Americans saw unmarried parenthood as bad for society. 48% said unmarried couples raising children was negative for society. And 40% said it was bad for children to be raised by gay parents. Although we should note that 46% of the population said it made no difference. Also, 39% said it was bad for couples to live together without getting married, and 53% said it made no difference. This chart shows the percentage of births occurring to unmarried women and how it has gone up from 1990 to 2016. The blue is 1990 and the orange is 2016, and it shows the difference for whites, Hispanics, and blacks in America. So in 1990, 15% of births were to unmarried women, whereas in 2016 it was 28%. For Hispanics, it rose from 34% to 52%. And in 1990, the figure was already over 50% for blacks. It was 63%, and it has gone up somewhat to 69% between 1990 and 2016, 63 to 69%. There are two tables I want to look at in regard to the birth rate in Europe in 2019 and 2020. They appear on this slide and the next. Europe is facing quite a crisis in that their number of births is not sustainable for the population. You'll see on the right side of this slide a note right at the bottom that says fertility rates need to exceed 2.1 for replenishment. Now, as we look at this, we can see that the countries are ordered in terms of high to low for 219, and then the numbers in the 220 column will vary because they're not in the same order there. So in 2019, France had the highest birth rate at 1.852, which is still well below 2.1 for replenishment. You can see it's gone up a little bit in 2020. Sweden has 1.85 in 2019, 1.909. Ireland has gone up slightly, and it is now the highest in Europe at 1.98 in 2020. Let's just look at the 2020 column now. In Russia, it's 1.751. In Iceland, 1.921. I've thrown in the USA here for comparison. You can see the USA is also below the sustainability rate. It's at 1.886. Denmark, 1.762. Montenegro, 1.657. The Netherlands, 1.75. Czech Republic, I'll stop mentioning the numbers here and just note the countries. Then Romania, Albania, Slovenia, Estonia, Germany, Bulgaria, Serbia, Malta, Luxembourg, Croatia, Ukraine, Poland, Cyprus, and Spain. And we can see here that Spain, for example, and some other countries already noted, there has been a slight increase in the birth rate. And there's no comment here about why that might be. It may well be that this has to do with immigration numbers. And then one of the major things to look at in Europe is who is having babies. Or is it the new immigrants that have come in from the Middle East and from Africa? Or is it the case that the population overall is either in decline or in increasing? That would be another important statistic to look at. Just note also on this page a few other things. Niger in 2020 is the #1 in the world for fertility, with its rate at 7.153. That desert-like country in the middle of Africa, or just to the north of the middle. And a few comments are made by this source of World Population Review about why there may be decline in birth rate in Europe. A few quotes. One quote is, "There are three main factors that have been credited for a decrease in the global fertility rate. Fewer deaths in childhood, greater access and use of contraception, and more women are getting an education and joining the workforce." Let me just make a comment about that. Why would fewer deaths in childhood contribute to a decrease in the global fertility rate? It's because people would not decide to have another child if a child dies. So if you ended up having 2 children but only one lived to adulthood, that would count as 2 children for birth. So that would be one reason. And then when it says greater access and use of contraception, we should also be aware of the fact that this sort of statistic or sort of comment would bring in the discussion about abortion. And so many countries have allowed abortion, particularly in the West. And then more women are getting an education and joining the workforce. This would relate to postponing marriage in order to get the education, and then wanting to work using their education, so therefore not wanting a large family. And so those factors are interrelated with other issues. Another quote, "The average age for first-time mothers in Italy is 31 years. And the source reflects as follows about this. A large reason is they are not yet financially ready to raise a child, and the government doesn't help with the cost of childcare." Now, in some countries in Europe, like in Croatia or France, the government does quite a bit to help with childcare, and that then would give those countries an incentive to have more children. And they may also help depending on the number of children you have. And various countries have various programs in place, usually, to try to incentivize families having more children. Italy is a case in point where that's not the case. And some other factors are mentioned on this site as well that contribute to the decline in the birth rate. Another one is the decline in the desired number of children. There's a lot there to unpack. Why would people not want to bring children into the world? What's their motivation? And various suggestions are made, and they're difficult to get a good handle on what's behind that simple statement of a decline in the desired number of children? Is it that people are just not that interested in marriage? Is it that even if they do marry, they're more interested in living a life that isn't encumbered by having children? They just enjoy their lives um, for themselves. Or is it they're afraid to bring children into the world for some reason? Is it that they're convinced that they should contribute to the environment in the world by not having children because they feel that there are too many children in the world? And given birth control and abortion and those sorts of things, if a woman falls pregnant, she may just decide, no, I'm not going to bring more children into the world. Another issue that is mentioned on this website is the changing of gender roles. You don't have the traditional wife who stays at home to raise the children. This, again, is related to women in the workforce. Here are some of the reasons. Now let's look at another chart as we continue to look at countries in Europe. And as we do so, we'll continue to look down the number. These are the higher countries in Europe at birth rates, all still below the 2.1 replenishment mark. So in the UK, we've had an increase in birth rate, but it's only up to 1.871 in 2020. Still going in order of the 2019 list, we have Latvia, Belgium, Belarus, Norway, Lithuania, Switzerland, Finland, Austria, Slovakia, Macedonia, Hungary, and then Italy, Greece, Portugal. Now Portugal is listed here. Just make a note that Portugal is now the third last in a list of 199 countries. And then we have Bosnia-Herzegovina, then Moldova, and then South Korea. Taiwan is now listed in last place at number 199 for the year 2020 at a birth fertility rate of 1.218. Over the past few decades, there has been a growing and perfect storm around the issue of marriage in the West. There has been, on the one hand, a devaluing of marriage, having to do with the increased cohabitation or no-fault divorce. And then there's also been a valuing of sexual aberrations that culture never thought would be considered normal. I refer to the LGBTQI and so on, sexual aberrations that have become aggressively present in the culture, and to the point that to speak against them is considered morally immoral. So homophobia, for example, has come to be a new term since the 1960s when it was coined by the psychologist George Weinberg. It's politically incorrect to state that homosexuality is wrong, and it's been considered as deviant to claim that homosexuality is wrong, hence a term like homophobia. Decriminalization of homosexual behavior since Stonewall Inn in 1969. There was a raid on homosexuals that led to bringing it into the focus of discussion, and then the promotion of the idea that speaking out against homosexuals or mistreating them was itself deviant. And so this was considered a victimized group. And around this grew a new morality of having sympathy for, and then giving place to, and then putting on a pedestal those who had once been considered deviant. There's also a chicken and an egg issue going on here. Up until 1973, the American Psychological Association listed homosexuality as a disorder. It was said that as a disorder, it increased anxiety, um, trouble with a person's moods. Uh, it increased the possibility of substance abuse and also suicidal thoughts and plans. Then the thought came, well, that wasn't, um, maybe that was the cause of these disorders rather than that the disorders went along with the practice. And so it became stigmatized to uh, consider this as a disorder. The disorder was the rest of us who were treating the people in such a way that it led to their disorders. That was the argument. Now, it also became politically incorrect to research the matter, so this became more of a statement, an unproved thesis. And many health issues are associated with homosexuality have been quietly ignored. We could also talk about perspectives. In 2001, 57% of Americans opposed same-sex marriage and 35% approved. By 2017, 62% approved of same-sex marriage and 32% opposed it, according to the Pew Research Center. And you may remember that during the presidency of Barack Obama, he presented himself as trying to come to a position on this and eventually affirming homosexuality during his presidency. I leave it to you to decide whether that was a sincere search or whether it was presenting a process of gradual thinking and change so that he could try to lead the country along that same pathway, but already perhaps held to those views. There's also the issue of the extension of rights. Heterosexual civil unions have been affirmed in various countries. Marital rights have been extended apart from marriage to cohabiting adults, making marriage somewhat obsolete in the law's eyes. And then there has been a movement from civil unions to a new understanding of marriage with respect to homosexuality, where the famous Obergefell versus Hodges decision of the United States Supreme Court in 2015 allowed marriage to be understood as not only between a man and a woman, but between anybody, male and male, female and female as well, or whatever gender identity someone might claim. Then there's also been the normalizing of the abnormal, transgenderism and bisexuality, non-binary views of sexuality have also come into prominence. Intersexuality, the suppressing studies and information about the health risks to homosexuals and bisexuals has been documented in a work that I recommend, The Health Hazards of Homosexuality, what the medical and psychological research reveals. And then there's also re-education, sexualizing children and indoctrinating them to accept sexually deviant behaviors through a sex education program in public schools. This does appear in the US, but it has been aggressively in the news in schools in the UK. Relationships and sex education laws for children as young as 4 years old have appeared. And you might also look at the All About Me program in the UK that has done two things, or will do two things if implemented. And the discussion has been about implementing it in 2020. The one thing it does is it sexualizes children. It makes them start thinking about sexuality before they really understand sexuality or themselves as sexual beings. And then secondly, it presents sexual options to children that, from a Christian perspective, are sin and not things in which to encourage children at all. And so in these various ways, we've seen an attack on traditional understandings of marriage and sexuality. As we continue a list of pressures on the concept of marriage, another one would be polygamy. In 2003, 7% of the population saw polygamy as morally acceptable. This figure rose to 17% by 2017. Now, there are some other issues that aren't directly about marriage, but indirectly affect marriage and the understanding of what is involved in marriage. If we extend this discussion not only to issues of sexuality, but also to children. And so we might mention, for example, pedophilia has been considered on the fringes of society and considered negatively as an abuse of children. But there are voices that are advocating an acceptance of pedophilia as a normal sexual orientation, as we see now in California schools. We might also mention prostitution. If we understand marriage as the place where sex is acceptable, the marriage bed is undefiled, says Hebrews chapter 13. Well, then alternatives put pressure on marriage. And so, for example, we see in regard to prostitution that there are some pressing to legalize this in society. And they may have reasons of trying to decriminalize it so that it's safer, not in the shadows, not a crime to lock people up over, and so on. There are other issues, but in terms of family, obviously it's a direct attack on the family. The New York Assembly is pressing for its legalization. Conversion therapy has been banned in 19 states now. And so what this is about is saying that if someone is exploring another sexual preference other than being heterosexual, then to try to treat that person to help them come out of that is wrong. This has affected the counseling world, but it also affects churches, and some of these states want churches also to be banned from trying to counsel against this sexual deviancy. And we need to couple that with the aggressive attempt to give children who have not yet formed their own self-understanding the opportunity to suppress their hormonal development and physical development and take drugs and eventually to have a sex change. This is the exact opposite of any attempt at trying to counsel people against these aberrations. And then there's also the very positive notion in Western culture these days around intersectionality. This has to do with the postmodern perspective that those who had been marginalized must now be prioritized. And the more identities that you can collect from the margins, the better you are. So there's a preference for groups claiming victimhood over groups that are perceived as having held privilege and having been in control of culture in the past, like Christians. There is an understanding of a liberation, of a struggle for power in the culture that needs to be pitted against the traditional understanding of the family, which is considered as an oppressive restriction that is not for everyone. And this is particularly, for example, in the literature of the Black Lives Matter movement on their webpage. They want to replace the traditional family with these alternatives. And so then in these ways we see marriage under severe attack in the West. This lecture has had the intention of bringing out some statistics and trends on issues around the family, on marriage and children. And so the discussion has primarily been about presenting material regarding these things in the U.S. and also somewhat in the West in general. Now, in conclusion, I just want to make a few quick points, and some of these have not been developed in the lecture. First of all, we do see from what we've looked at that the family is strained and under attack in Western society today, and that for various reasons. But secondly, I'd like to suggest that the family is the building block for society. Now, this is an argument that goes right back to Plato and Aristotle in their work on economics and on politics. My point would be that the family is a building block for society in a number of ways, including the following. It offers a norm around which other discussions of politics and family and societies and community can be considered. If the family is important as a unit, it should be protected. It should be encouraged. And this doesn't mean that others who do not have their own family are excluded. Rather, as a basic building block, this norm then can be what it has the stability in society, and others can connect to it. Being in a family brings people stability, and being connected, if one doesn't have a family, to a family can bring stability to them. The family is a basic building block for society in that it defines identity. Children grow up understanding gender and gender roles. Some of this is cultural, and some of it is related to the very basics of the way God made us, male and female, and also in the roles that He gives us in life as we grow into men and women and husbands and wives. It provides a self-confidence in one's identity because of the stability that one finds in it, especially for children growing up. For example, one of the reasons that some boys are attracted to homosexuality is an absent father. And so that's the kind of thing I also have in mind here. The family is a building block for society, for finances. Broken homes tend toward poverty, and that may be a chicken and egg thing. But the fact is that the two can be correlated. And also education. A good, stable family is a place in which children can grow up in every which way, including in their education. Now, the final point I would like to make at the end of this lecture is that the church is an extended family. It includes families. It's made up of building block families, but it is also made up of the never married, the singles, and the orphaned. And so the church then offers a family type structure to everyone. Individual families are key to that larger structure, but the larger structure, in being larger, can include others who do not have their own families. We see this, for example, in 1 Timothy 5, where Paul talks about how to care for the widows as the church if the family can't care for them. So the church becomes the extended family, by way of example. So in a context in which the family is strained and under attack in Western society, the church can offer what's lacking. And where young people get married at a much later age, and where the divorce rate is so high, and where other challenges are facing the family, the church can come in and meet the needs that a family often provides. And so the church is very important. And that means the church needs to function like a family. It can't just be a worship center where large groups of people come and observe worship and sermons and then leave. But the very definition of the church should be more familial in order to help provide this very important function of family. It also is a way of stabilizing marriages and a way of giving definition to where sexuality is appropriate, that is, in the marriages and for the production of the families for the church. So these things are related, and the church is central to that for the Christian community.